Hello and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, December 17th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Recordings of this series of programs and links to the articles we refer to today can be found on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at carl@newsfromneptune.com. Our program concentrates on the news of U.S. war-making, which is generally not reported, not by accident, in the U.S. media. It seems clear that Brexit, the plan to remove Britain from the European Union, was the major issue and made the difference in the election in the UK this last week. It was the issue a few years ago in 2017 when Labour did much better. And Labour's electoral disaster this week seems to be a result of the arguments over Brexit too. As one Labour activist put it, quote, in 2017, Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the Labour Party, in 2017, Corbyn was our leader. Our manifesto was radical. Manifesto was the party program. Our position on Brexit was to respect the referendum, that is, the decision by the British people to withdraw from the European Union. In 2019, Corbyn was our leader. Our manifesto was radical, and our position on Brexit was to have a second referendum. Can we get a bit real about this? His suggestion is that there was one major difference between Labour's success in 2017 and its disaster this last week. And the difference was the change in position in rejecting the decision to leave the European Union, which is what the Labour Party did. A parallel may be drawn between Trump's electoral success and Boris Johnson, the head of the Conservative Party and the new Prime Minister of Britain. Trump and Johnson enjoyed similar electoral successes. Trump was elected by 2012 Obama voters, that is, people who had voted for Obama in 2012, who stayed home or didn't vote for Obama's successor, that is, Hillary Clinton, in 2016. They no longer believed in Obama's hope and change. That caused 6 states that had gone for Obama in 2012, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio, and Florida, to desert his successor and flip to Trump in 2016. That made Trump president. Voters in the most recent elections in the U.S. and UK rejected their situation under neoliberal policies directed from Brussels or Washington. That can be seen as a populist protest. Populism has been called an ideology that, quote, pits a virtuous and homogeneous people, imagine so, against a set of elites and dangerous others who are together depicted as depriving or attempting to deprive the sovereign people of their rights, values, prosperity, identity, and voice. That, in sum, is what a substantial part of the population in the U.S. and the U.K. did in electing Trump and Boris Johnson as their leaders. In addition, it wouldn't be surprising if voters in both countries resent the attempt to ignore or reverse their choice by Russiagate and impeachment in the U.S. and by not instituting Brexit, the withdrawal from the EU, in the U.K. There is a strong sense in America and in Britain that if the populace votes for something, it should happen. And the attempt to reverse the 2016 election and the pro-Brexit vote are resented by the general population in both countries. On the question of whether Britain should leave the European Union, the British left has been nearly uniform in supporting Remain, stay in the Union. This option seems especially attractive since those advocating leave the European Union on the right range from open racists concerned with the recent growth of immigration to romantic global free marketeers. For entirely understandable cultural and political reasons, the left has not wished to be associated with that crowd. But in supporting Remain in the EU, the left is making a profound mistake, one capable of destroying its future whether Britain is in or out of the EU. This was written well before the recent election, but it seems to me to capture what really is at stake and the real reason the British left, such as it is, did so badly in this last election. There are several flaws in the case made by left advocates of Remain. Here I want to consider three in particular. First is the idea, fostered especially by the dynamic Greek former finance minister Yanis Varoufakis, that left politics today can only be advanced by concerted action within the EU. As I will argue, this is a fantasy, and by adhering to it, the British left is likely to undermine itself seriously, as the Greek left may already be doing. And since this was written, both those prophecies were carried out. Next is the claim that Brexit would hasten the breakup of the United Kingdom, and consequently, for long-standing reasons of electoral demography, spell doom for Labour as a party of government. I argue that the opposite is the case. Brexit may well be the only thing that could hold the UK together and offer Labour the opportunity to rebuild on a national basis. Last is the assumption, which seems to underline much pro-Remain thinking on the left, that the EU is fundamentally different from the multinational trade agreements, most recently the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, that are reshaping the global economic order. While many leftists have clear and well thought out arguments against such trade partnerships, they give their unconsidered support to the EU, although it suffers from all the same failings and more. What this is about is the neoliberal policies that the trade partnerships and the European Union, and most importantly, of course, the American government, are foisting on their own countries and the rest of the world. As a consequence of these mistakes, the British left risks throwing away the one institution which it has historically been able to use effectively, that is, the democratic state, in favor of a constitutional order tailor-made for the interests of global capitalism and managerial politics, that is, the EU, the European Union. As the European jurisprudence of the EU has developed, it has consistently undermined standard left policies such as state aid to industries and nationalization. Constitutional structures that are largely outside the reach of citizens have, in the modern world, tended almost invariably to block the kind of radical policies that the left has traditionally believed in. The central fact about the EU, which the British governing class has never really got its head around, is that it creates a written constitution and ancillary judicial structures that are extremely hard to alter. Neither British politicians nor the British electorate are used to this, since Britain has never had such a thing, a written constitution, and they're treating the referendum as if it were a general election campaign with short-term victories that could be reversed in a few years, rather than something with the long-term implication of the votes in 1788 on the American Constitution. This is an important point and has resonances in terms of our own notion of constitutionality and what can be done in the context of the constitutional structures. Yanis Varoufakis, the famous dissident economic commentator and former member of the Greek government, is one of the most significant left-wing politicians in Europe. As someone who witnessed one of its major crises from within, the crisis of the Greek democracy, he speaks with authority about the character of the European Union project. His accounts of the discussions in the councils of Europe about the Euro crisis, featuring ignorant and preening finance ministers bent almost exclusively on the exercise of power, are a graphic illustration of what actually happens within the EU. Varoufakis is also important because despite his first-hand experience of the limits of the European Union, he believes it can be reformed. More than that, he hopes that a pan-European left will be revived through the institutions of the EU, and that hope is repeatedly echoed by pro-EU figures within the British Labour Party. But it would be a profound mistake for the British left to follow Varoufakis' loyalty to the European project, to see why we should go back to the theorist with whom Varoufakis himself continues to identify, the founding father of the European left, Karl Marx. One of Marx's most striking insights was the observation that the various constitutions of the French republics, with their imitations in other continental states, were deliberately designed to obstruct progress towards genuine democracy. Though the French Revolution had introduced universal suffrage, its significance was immediately undermined by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and by constitutional structures that precluded the kind of social transformation that the revolution's radicals wanted. Marx emphasized this repeatedly in his writings of the 1840s, and the failure of the revolutions of 1848 and the restoration of the constitutional orders in Europe only confirmed his judgment. Accordingly, Marx felt only a total revolution would be able to overturn the bourgeois, as he called it, liberal economic and political constitutions that stood in the way of substantive social change. Marx, and still more Engels, thought England was different. The House of Commons was unconstrained by the kind of constitutional apparatus seen on the continent, since Parliament was famously omnicompetent, and the lords and the monarchy were largely irrelevant. Marx and Engels concluded that once the English working class got the vote, it would be able to use the House of Commons to achieve its political and economic goals peacefully. The accidents of history that had delivered this exceptional institution meant that revolution ought not to be necessary for the kind of social transformation Marx and Engels had in mind. The early members of the Labour Party in England, who were more Marxist than their successors cared to admit, understood this and believed that a properly organized working class, using representation in the House of Commons as its vehicle, could institute radical economic and social change. And compared with the life of the working class in the 19th century, working class life after the growth of labor vindicated their confidence. Indeed, the greatest achievement of the Labour Party, the creation of the National Health Service after World War II, would have been impossible in a country with strong constitutional constraints on the legislature, since it required the large-scale expropriation of private property in the shape of the old endowed hospitals. This is a major reason why so few countries have adopted the NHS model, in National Health Service model of Britain. In most of them, it would have been illegal, just as similar proposals would be illegal in the EU today, and of course they're illegal in the US as well. The push for Medicare for all is a stopgap on the direction of the sort of plan that the National Health Service had for free health care in 1945. But in America, we're not even close to that. In the 1980s, however, demoralized labor politicians in Britain began to seek the shelter of continental-style constitutional structures. The most important of these was the EU itself, the European Union, which functions as a set of constraints on the internal politics of its member states, exactly as did the bourgeois constitutions of the mid-19th century. We've got to remember that's the real issue. The U.S. Bill of Rights grew out of the fact that there was a clear understanding and a great fear of the fact that the new government being put together after the American Revolution would be a threat to the rights and prosperity of the country as a whole, in the interests of those who held wealth and power in North America at the time. There are many reasons why the left began to lose faith in a system that did not have constitutional constraints. That is the way Britain was at the beginning of in the 20th century. Partly it was distressed by Thatcher's electoral success, though in fact the Labour Party split largely over Europe in the immediate aftermath of her first electoral victory, before the scale of the transformation she would usher in was clear. Indeed, the split in the Labour Party itself facilitated that transformation. The general turn to a discourse of human rights also served to weaken the intellectual case for an omnicompetent democratic legislature, despite the fact that in Britain that legislature had largely coexisted with a remarkably tolerant and liberal social order. No matter the cause, however, the main outcome was that British politics became, for the first time, constrained by the EU commitments. That was in the Thatcher years, which paralleled the Reagan years in this country. The left in all of Great Britain has suffered as a result. The same structures that the eighth president of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, promised to use in the interests of the working class turned out by the time of the 2007 and 8 financial crash to have been used instead to push through a variety of neoliberal economic and social policies that have only damaged the European working class. This, of course, would not have surprised Marx. As he understood, the point of constitutional structures such as the EU is almost always to enshrine and make permanent the political and social assumptions of their moment of creation. And that, of course, is true of the American Constitution as well. As a Marxist, and giving his own bruising encounter with EU institutions, Yanis Varoufakis should perhaps see this better than anyone. But despite fiercely criticizing the way the EU handled the Greek crisis, Varoufakis has remained loyal to the idea that left-wing politics can be pushed through using EU institutions if only the parties of the left across Europe can properly coordinate their activities. History would suggest that this is a vain hope. Even if Europe's left parties do succeed in forging a common program, the EU is not the kind of political entity whose approach to the world can be altered by popular politics. Popular politics is precisely what the EU is designed to obstruct. Like independent central banks and constitutional courts, its institutions are essentially technocratic. Technocracy is not, as some like to pretend, a neutral or rational system of government. Indeed, it confers immense power on culturally select bodies whose prejudices will be those of the class their members are drawn from. Varoufakis believes that the EU may change, and many in the British Labour Party agree, but the kind of shift in European politics that Varoufakis and others want to see is simply not possible within the present structures of the EU. It would require sweeping institutional change of a kind nowhere on the agenda. Without that, like the Labour Party in Britain, the left in Europe is reliant purely on an article of faith, a conviction that the left must prevail, even in the face of all the constraints imposed on popular sovereignty by the EU. The British governing class in the late 20th century threw away the most valuable institution it had inherited, an institution whose preservation was the most obvious imperative for their predecessors, a House of Commons that was not constrained by a constitution. A vote to stay within the EU will render their casual trashing of it irrevocable and end any hope of genuinely left politics in the UK. This is an account of the situation of Britain and the European Union well before the current election, or the recent election in Europe, which has delivered a mandate to the British government to leave the European Union, a sort of second Brexit vote. And how that is accomplished will be the problem of Europe in the coming days, but the analysis offered here seems to me to be accurate and appropriate for understanding even our own situation in this country. You're listening to Aware on the Air. We are considering the news of the week and its coverage by the media. The left case for Brexit we were looking at, and the history of American warfare is the subject primarily of our discussions here. There were some interesting developments in that in the last week and so that tell us more about American war making. And to understand what happened here, we should recall the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers, officially titled Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force, is the United States Department of Defense history of the United States political and military involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. An official history, in other words, not for publication, an official history of the American attacks on Vietnam and an attempt by the American government to understand what it had done and why, rather than an attempt to give an account to the world at large of what the U.S. had done. The papers were released. Released is the word that's appropriate because they were obviously captive by the American government. And it was a secret project entirely where the American government tried to understand how it had gotten involved in Vietnam. The papers were released by Daniel Ellsberg, who had worked on the study. They were first brought to the attention of the public on the front page of the New York Times in 1971. And it took a Supreme Court case to make that possible because, of course, the American government didn't want any of this material released to the public. A 1996 article in the New York Times said that the Pentagon Papers had demonstrated, among other things, that the Johnson administration, quote, systematically lied not only to the public, but also to Congress in getting that war going. Now we are speaking this month of the Afghanistan Papers, a set of his internal documents from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. And that was the name of the organization that produced this secret study of American warfare. The papers were obtained by the Washington Post through a Freedom of Information Act request, and they document the U.S. war in Afghanistan. Whereas an organization is particularly concerned with the U.S. war in Afghanistan, not only that it's an ongoing operation, but that it commenced almost 20 years ago, just after the formation of AWARE and the lies and misrepresentations by the American government for its attack on Afghanistan in 2001 was one of the first topics that AWARE wanted to talk about to our friends and neighbors in Champaign-Urbana. The Afghanistan Papers produce an account of the American war against Afghanistan, the American attack on Afghanistan, that of course the American government doesn't want spread abroad, but the Freedom of Information Act, thankfully enough, and for the moment, made that possible. The documents reveal that high-ranking officials were generally of the opinion that the war was unwinnable, but that kept this hidden from the public in order to keep the war going. An important article appeared in the Journal of the Nation on this subject this last week by Major Danny Shurjan. His article is entitled, "We've Just Been Handed the Pentagon Papers for Our Generation." He's talking about these Afghanistan documents. Shurjan is a former history instructor at West Point. He was deployed with reconnaissance units in Iraq and Afghanistan as an Army officer. He's written a memoir and critical analysis of the Iraq War called, quote, Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge, close quote. The Afghanistan Papers are a devastating indictment of our military and political leaders, write surgeons. The question is, will anyone notice? He writes, in a piece published in The Nation this week, I remember the day I broke. I was a young captain in command of an 82-man cavalry troop in the heart of Taliban country, in Kandahar, Afghanistan, and I was deep into one of my regular manic episodes. At that moment, I was in the midst of writing an angry, definitely hopeless, stream of consciousness screed, which topped out at some 8,000 words, It's about as many words as I managed to get into an hour of this program. To my sociopathic squadron commander. My verbose, yet well-argued, treatise expressed my opposition to his next planned assault, with my unit in the lead, into yet another remote, abandoned, booby-trapped, riddled village. I was by then obsessed with protecting my troopers from needless death or maiming. Mid-sentence, one of my subordinate lieutenants rushed into the office to remind me, "Sir, you have to give a memorial address in like 30 minutes. Shaken out of my trance, I remembered, had I really forgotten, that it was almost time to give my obligatory speech in remembrance of one of my young soldiers, blown to pieces just days before. I hid my surprise, assured the lieutenant I'd be ready soon, and pulled out a 5x7 index card to hastily jot down some bullet notes for my impending address. Normally, I thrive in public speaking, but suddenly I drew a frightful blank. I don't know anything about this kid, I realized. He was young, new to the unit, and though I'd heard growing reports on his discipline and work ethic, I couldn't conjure a single personal detail about or one-on-one interaction with him. Maybe a better officer would have. Still, I threw something together, gave a passable speech, which was, as always, filmed for the soldier's family, then retreated to the designated smoke pit to share some cigarettes with his platoon mates. They were sort of numb, frightened for their own fates, yet alarmingly resigned to their personal hellscape. None, not a one, had any particular affinity for the Afghan people, nor did they believe in the mission. I listened carefully as they swapped stories about their fallen friend. Then it struck me, I'll never be able to explain to this kid's mother just what he died for on that dusty trail in rural Afghanistan. That was back in 2011, year 10 of what has become America's 18-year war, 19 now, and its longest ever. Unlike the war in Iraq, which I joined just after West Point graduation, I'd entered Afghanistan already skeptical of the nation's post-11 wars. The trick was to escape a year-long tour with as many of my troopers' lives and limbs as possible. When our unit finally made it home in January 2012, there was 3 fewer lives and several fewer limbs, I rapidly fell apart. It was a legitimate, if sudden, mental health collapse, brought on, I suppose, the moment I stopped white-knuckling it through 18-hour days borne under the substantial weight of command responsibility. In the years that followed, I lost 2 wives and never quite shook bouts of crippling depression and anxiety. And the war had never stopped churning. But I also became an outspoken anti-war activist, criticizing the wars, in Afghanistan in particular, which I long knew were unwinnable and based on lies. Earlier this week, we learned that our leaders also knew the war was a fiasco, doomed to fail. But unlike many of us, they chose not to speak out. Instead, as the Washington Post revealed in a series of stunning articles based on what it has labeled the Afghanistan Papers, a trove of previously classified documents that it's calling a secret history of the war, dozens of consecutive generals and senior U.S. officials had repeatedly lied about, omitted, and obfuscated the facts to give an illusion of progress in that war. Examples abound. As early as 2003, Bush's hawkish Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, apparently admitted, quote, "I have no visibility into who the bad guys are," close quote, in Afghanistan. More than a decade later, during the late Obama years, retired Army Lieutenant General Doug Lute, once the Afghan war czar, conceded to one of the interviewers, quote, "We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking," close quote. Perhaps even more troubling, in a throwback to the Vietnam War, to Vietnam War era stat fudging, making up numbers, one unnamed Army colonel confessed, quote, "Every data point was altered to present the best possible picture," close quote. As I read through these confessions, Washington Post Afghanistan papers, I felt somewhat vindicated, but mostly I felt deeply sad. What had it all been for? The 2,400 American lives lost, the $1 trillion spent, and what are the costs to the real victims, the Afghan people? More than 100,000 Afghan civilian and security force personnel have been killed thus far. The U.S. military wasn't responsible for all those deaths. The vicious Taliban had been gleeful contributors to the carnage. But 2018 wasn't just the deadliest year of the war. It was also the first in which American and allied Afghan troops killed more civilians than the Taliban did. The Afghanistan papers don't try to answer these bigger questions, and perhaps they can't, but their significance is nonetheless profound. At 2,000 pages, they're nothing less than the Pentagon Papers of my generation. So writes Danny Surgeon. These documents, however, are hitting the news in a very different time and context. In 1971, there were still tens of thousands of anti-war protesters in the streets, and Daniel Ellsberg's leak of the documents inflamed the movement. An overwhelming majority of Americans opposed the Vietnam War in 1971 and thought of it as a crime, not just as a mistake. Today, in the absence of a broad military draft and with President Trump's impeachment as entertainment hearings dominating the airwaves, I'm not sure the Afghanistan papers will make much of a splash. In a real republic, these papers would be explosive, triggering investigations, denunciations, and serious policy conversations. The Senate will hold a lengthy inquest, such as the Fulbright hearings on Vietnam or the Church Committee on CIA abuses, in addition to producing substantive reports similar to the 9/11 Commission or the McCain-Feinstein CIA torture report. But I'm skeptical. If this Afghan disclosure doesn't generate thorough investigation and accountability, can the concerned citizenry ever again count on Congress? Probably not. The same question might be asked of our news media. Major publications still give prominent placement to the vacuous mea culpas from prominent Afghan war commanders like David Petraeus, and the big three cable networks offer unlimited time to the should-be discredited likes of Petraeus, Stanley McChrystal, and a litany of other Bush-Obama-era military and intelligence officials. Meanwhile, folks like myself, this is Danny Surgeon writing this, Scott Horton, Matthew Ho, retired Colonels Andrew Basevich and Daniel Davis, who were right all along about the war in Afghanistan, struggle mightily to place a rare column in the major newspapers. The game is rigged. Still, try as they may, and they will, the lying, failed generals can't escape the people they sent into war. Unfortunately, the people they made war on is a different matter. Just last week, I randomly bumped into General Petraeus in line for the bathroom at LaGuardia Airport. I thought it odd that no one seemed to recognize the man, who did more to prolong the forever wars than any other public figures, but I did. Against my better instincts, I stopped him. "Hello, General. I'm sure you don't remember me, but we briefly met in Iraq in 2007. Although he was cordial at first, I noticed him gazing at my chest, and then he quickly hustled off. I looked down and had to laugh. I'd completely forgotten that I was wearing my Iraq Veterans Against the War t-shirt. King David Petraeus, as he was dubbed, can comfortably hide behind his 7-figure salary, think tank, consulting jobs, and unlimited access to the mainstream media. So can his entire generation of flag officers who lost 2 wars, and not one of whom resigned in protest in face of the unwinnable forever conflicts. But every once in a while, they have to look me and hundreds of thousands of broken vets like me in the eye. Long ago, after the insane, absurd advice he received from his senior military advisors in the Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis fiascos, President John F. Kennedy, himself a decorated World War II veteran, wisely concluded, quote, "The first thing I'm going to tell my successor is watch the generals, to avoid feeling that just because they're military men, their opinions on military matters are worth a damn," close quote. I, for one, will be hard-pressed to ever trust them again. Much of the blood of a war that shouldn't have been fought and that might have been stopped lies on their hands, close quote. That's Danny Surgeon, a retired military Army officer who, writing about the publication of the Afghanistan papers, an Inspector General's report of the Afghanistan War that was pried loose by Freedom of Information Act requests by the Washington Post. Quite remarkable given what the Washington Post has been doing in spreading propaganda recently. Here's another follow-up to that. The Trump administration has announced that 4,000 troops are to be removed from Afghanistan, leaving 8,000 there. And Chris Hedges is interviewed about what this means, why the Washington Post Afghanistan article got so little coverage, and commentary on how this is a bipartisan war, Republican and Democrat, and therefore there will be no hearings about it. This discussion of this matter by Chris Hedges, of course, is not found on American television, but you can see it on the program in question on RT. It also, the same program also covers American war by other means, U.S. sanctions that affect 39 countries whose combined population makes up a third of the world, attacking, of course, the most vulnerable. The interviewee is Sarah Flounders, co-director of the International Action Center from New York City. Her website is sanctionskill.org. Flounders points out that sanctions kill more people than bombs or guns. There's also a graphic from sanctionskill.org displayed about where the U.S. is levying sanctions. Flounders and Hedges are speaking eminent sense here. It's a very good episode, far better than anything we've seen on Democracy Now! In a long time. There are also shorter segments with footage from India on the protests against their citizenship bill, where protesting citizens argue that letting in non-Muslims fleeing persecution from neighboring countries will, quote, dilute native people's influence, close quote. There's also footage from Beirut, Lebanon, protests over, quote, dwindling cash flow and the delay to form a new government, close quote. The Washington Post articles on Afghanistan that I just referred to is the Post-only actual war journalism, as opposed to war propaganda like their Russiagate stories usually are. It stands out from the Trump derangement syndrome one usually gets from the Washington Post, and those who don't point out how the Washington Post came to be known as, quote, the CIA's favorite newspaper, such as other fellow Russiagate supporters. After being a chief Russiagate proponent and never retracting known lies, like the time they claimed Russia infiltrated the American electrical grid by way of an electrical station in Vermont, a complete lie, the Washington Post surprises us with a clear indictment of how the war in Afghanistan became the U.S. longest war. The U.S. war on drugs, which date back to President Nixon, never seems to be counted with these assessments. And I'd argue that in many ways the U.S. war on drugs dates back even long before that. Under Presidents G.W. Bush and Obama, it's clear that the public was told nothing but lies about the Afghan war. It was even lying about whether this war was actually a war at all. Trump is following Bush and Obama's lead by continuing this war, and the Afghan war helps make Trump the second U.S. president to be at war for his entire presidency, at least to date. For this, Trump certainly deserves criticism. But Trump should share in that criticism with Bush and Obama for having begun and carried out the bulk of the Afghanistan war, respectively. Trump derangement syndrome loyalists like Harry Shearer, who hosts a longtime radio show under the title Le Show, took a notable respite from his usual ways. Shearer covered some of the Washington Post article in his December 15, 2019 episode of Le Show. Somehow all this presidential lying to justify starting and keeping the Afghan war going, the $1 trillion cost of this war so far, and all the lives lost in the war so far don't qualify either Presidents Bush or Obama to be derisively mentioned, as Shearer makes a point to do when he mentioned Trump's name. Shearer regularly says the words President Trump at the same time he's laughing, as if to suggest Trump isn't really the U.S. president. In fact, the December 15, 2019 episode of Le Show is one of the few times you won't hear Shearer mention Trump's name that way. There are responses to the Washington Post article from people mentioned in that article in the Post. I will put those links on the Facebook page to Aware on the Air. Elsewhere on YouTube, there are important aspects of the discussion of American war-making ongoing presently that you won't find in mainstream media. The U.S.-backed war in Central America is described in an interview with Chris Hedges and by Oscar Martinez. The Inspector General's report is discussed in an interview with Marin Mattei. Mattei interviews Matt Taibbi on the Inspector General's report and the consequences for media. Going Underground with Afshin Ratansi interviews Jimmy Dore on Russiagate, the IG report, and how the Democrats are essentially promoting Trump's re-election. An interview with to become a bit more local, an interview with Morgan Spurlock on Super Size Me 2, the sequel to Super Size Me, where he explores how people get their processed chicken, including chlorinated chicken, in the corporate-led fight to stifle Spurlock from getting us this information. This is sort of stuff you can find on YouTube that should be on mainstream media, of course, everything from war to poisoned food, but of course it isn't. And the thing that we here at News from Net, that we're on the air, and similar broadcasts across the country try to do is to alert people to the discussion that they're not getting from mainstream media. You are watching Aware on the Air, and we are discussing the various aspects of American war making and the stories you're not hearing elsewhere. I want to turn now to some other points. We'll begin with breaking news of the season. Santa Claus has been accused of quid pro quo for giving children gifts in exchange for good behavior. Legislatures have begun to hold hearings on impeaching Santa Claus after an overheard conversation seemed to imply he was offering a quid pro quo, gifts in exchange for good behavior. FBI agents spied on Claus at various malls as he repeatedly said things like, "Sure, I'll get you a pony, but first I need you to do something for me. Be a good little boy," close quote. The FBI was able to obtain a FISA warrant to spy on Claus because it's easier to get a FISA warrant than to get a Costco membership. "Ho, ho, no!" Santa Claus cried as investigators leaped out and cuffed him at a Dayton, Ohio mall. "Not good, sad." "It was a perfect conversation," Claus said, defending himself in a series of fiery tweets. "Absolutely perfect. I was simply talking to little Billy and asked him to keep tabs on his sister, Sally, who's been involved in some corruption. Who doesn't want to stop corruption? Did I offer Billy a new Nintendo Switch in exchange for his good behavior? Possibly. Am I planning on giving Sally coal because she's a little punk? Maybe. Where's my lawyer? Close quote. Unfortunately, Klaus was assigned a public defender who turned out to be Rudy Giuliani. Breaking news here at News from Neptune. We're on the air. We have another program here on Urbana Public Television under the title of News from Neptune, and old people sometimes get confused. I want to turn now to, unfortunately, a non-comedic, it is comedic, but it is not meant to be, account of the impeachment imbroglio in Washington. Important event, which once again is not being, I think, much featured on at least the news broadcast that I see, is a decision by the Supreme Court to review the lower court rulings involving congressional and prosecution subpoenas directed toward President Trump undercuts the second article of impeachment that passed the House Judiciary Committee along party lines last week. This is important because it seems to me that the first article of impeachment, it has to do with Ukraine-gate, is nonsense from the beginning, as we've discussed here before. The second article of impeachment charges President Trump with obstruction of Congress for refusing to comply with congressional subpoenas in the absence of a final court order. What the Democrats in the House are saying is that Trump should be impeached for not replying to the subpoenas, which he says he's not legally required to do. In charging him, the House Judiciary Committee has arrogated to itself the power to decide the validity of the subpoenas, as well as the power to determine whether claims of executive privilege must be recognized, both powers that properly belong with the judicial branch of our government, not the legislative branch. This point is made again and again, once again, in those few distant newscasts that exist, like Jimmy Dore's programs, for example, and remarkably enough, Tucker Carlson's program on Fox News. The notion here is that Trump should be impeached for not responding to these subpoenas, and his answer has been, I don't have to until the court tells me to, which is absolutely right. The suggestion is that the three branches of American government interrelate, and when there is a dispute between two of them, as there is now, it's up to the third to decide it. It seems eminent sense, even under the constitutional limitations that we're dealing with. President Trump has asserted that the executive branch, of which he is the head, need not comply with congressional subpoenas requiring the production of privileged executive material unless there's a final court order compelling such production. He's argued, appropriately, the judicial branch is the ultimate arbiter of conflicts between the legislative and executive branches, which indeed is the way the Constitution is designed. Even before the justices granted review of these cases, the two articles of impeachment had no basis in the Constitution. They were a reflection of the comparative voting power of the two parties, precisely what one of the founders, Alexander Hamilton, warned would be the greatest danger of an impeachment. The first article goes too far in authorizing impeachment based on the vague criterion of abuse of power. But it's the second article that truly endangers our system of checks and balances and the important role of the courts as the umpire between the legislative and executive branches under the Constitution. It would serve the national interest for thoughtful and independent-minded Democrats to join Republicans in voting against the second article of impeachment, even if they wrongly vote for the first. This arrangement that is being worked out by the Congress is a scandal, an attempt to reverse the last election, and ignore the real reasons that Trump, of course, should be impeached and removed from office, just like his predecessor should have been. That is, that he's committed, both of them have committed, the crime for which we hanged people at Nuremberg. The crime being the conduct of aggressive war. That's what Trump should be impeached for, as Obama should have been impeached for, not for these trumped up, technical violations that the Congress is working on. The publication Washington Babylon had an article this week entitled, "What Happens After Bernie Sanders Wins?" The best available evidence says the Democratic National Committee would again cheat him to prevent him from winning that party's primary. They did it in 2016. He knew it was going on as it happened. He didn't fight it, and we have footage of him endorsing his cheater, Hillary Clinton. A theoretical primary win by Sanders, who could most certainly defeat Trump in the 2020 election, would be the closest the DNC could come to motivating the public to vote to make him president. But in office, he'd face the same problems Trump faces now with a permanent government. The only thing that could really help him is a large-scale, well-organized public which continuously pushes for majoritarian values such as Medicare for all, a national jobs program, or a guaranteed annual income, gratis, that is free as in price college tuition, recalling all U.S. troops, contractors, and weapons, a 50% minimum cut in military spending to pay for all these other things, all of which is easily paid for with the trillions we'd save by not killing people around the world. You'd have one hell of a fight on your hands with Sanders himself, whose foreign policy seems to be neocon compatible. There are problems here, but the story isn't over. A story that has been rattling around for the last month and is important, far more important than it has been referred to by mainstream media. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is an intergovernmental organization and the implementing body for the Chemical Weapons Convention, which entered into force in 1997. An account by the journalist who resigned from Newsweek last week after editors refused to publish his work on the OPCW whistleblowers' complaints about the organization's handling of the claims that the Syrian Arab Army, that is the army of the government of Syria, used, let's start that over again. The jihadists that the U.S. is supporting against the government of Syria use chemical weapons in a place called Douma. Story might seem a little long and leading with a mass of irrelevant personal details, but to me this is fascinating both for its own sake and as an illustration of how it's usually journalists from unusual or non-credentialed backgrounds that one can expect the most truthful professional standards from, like the late Bob Perry of Consortium News or Seymour Hersh. This story, which, as I say, has been bubbling around the edge of mainstream media, I'll post on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. Meanwhile, the Inspector General's report on the 2016 FBI spying reveals a scandal of historic magnitude, not only for the FBI, but also for the U.S. media. The massive spying improprieties on the part of the FBI is as much a media scandal as it's a scandal for the agency and its leaders, writes Glenn Greenwald, and I'll put Greenwald's column on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air as well. You have been watching Aware on the Air. Produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Comments on this program are welcome. Email me at carl@newsfromneptune.com. We rely on a researcher, Jeff Nicholson, whose blog Digital Citizen we recommend highly. Here's a link to it on there's a link to it on our Facebook page, along with his detailed notes on this program. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are the real whistleblowers, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and including our liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and unconstitutional attacks on the free press, notably in the case of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, who's being tortured in prison by the U.S. government for the crime of telling the truth about our government's war crimes, something most Americans thought only happened in dictatorship, that perhaps they are right. Aware demonstrates against war on the first Saturday of every month in downtown Champaign, and has been doing so for almost 20 years. Here is a flyer distributed at our last demonstration. Impeach Trump is the U.S. political establishment's way of distracting you from America's war-making around the world. The U.S. media, owned by large corporations, continue to tell us how terrible President Trump is, but that's a way to avoid talking about how terrible U.S. government war-making is, most recently in Venezuela and Bolivia. And in regard to killing people around the world, the Trump administration's policy seems little different from that of the Obama administration, for all of President Trump's assertions that he wants to end the Obama-Clinton wars. President Obama inherited two shameful wars from the Bush administration in Afghanistan and Iraq, increased the number to 8, attacking Libya, Pakistan, the Philippines, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen as well. And Obama became the first U.S. president ever to be at war throughout 2 terms. Not even Presidents Roosevelt in World War II, Wilson in World War I, or Lincoln in the Civil War did that. As Barack Obama said in 2012, after ordering drone assassinations of American citizens, including minors, purposely, quote, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," close quote. While covering sin with smooth names, Obama continues America's long-standing foreign policy, attempting to prevent the integration of Eurasia for fear it would interfere with U.S. elites' economic exploitation of the rest of the world by American war provocations against Russia and China from Ukraine to the South China Sea. Trump, after criticizing Obama's war-making, has largely continued it, in part at least because he's under pressure from the deep state to maintain the traditional U.S. foreign policy of retarding the economic development of Russia and China. Now, this is Carl Estabrook. For the members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.